Heter Mechira. But in order to understand the yesod of the Heter Mechira, I just got to go over again the famous machlokes, the Beis Yosef and the Mabit. Very, very important machlokes. And this goes back, obviously, to the 1500s. I remember that the Beis Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, was the Rav of Tzfat. And the senior Dayan on his Beis Din was Rav Moshe ben Yosef Trani, who was a very, very great posek in his own right. And they had a major disagreement. And the major disagreement is, what is the status of fruit and other grain and vegetables that are produced are people for here? Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, we're mamish in the middle of something, so I apologize if people don't follow it. I'm just in the middle of something, I'm sorry. Okay. So the big machlokas, is not the best time to come. The Beis Yosef and the Mabit have a huge machlokas regarding the status of the holiness of the produce of Shemitah that is grown on the ground that belongs to non-Jews. According to Rav Yosef Karo, anything that grows on the ground that belongs to non-Jews does not have the holiness of Shemitah at all. It is what is called mufka. It is what is called separated. It is severed from the holiness of Shemitah. Now that means a number of things. Not only would a non-Jew be allowed to work the land, because that's very obvious. A non-Jew can work any land. The non-Jew has no isser of Shemitah. But it means that the produce that is grown on that land does not have the holiness of Shemitah. That's Rav Yosef Karo's shita. Peiros that grow on non-Jewish land is not subject to the Shemitah laws at all. Peiros that grow on non-Jewish land. That would mean that because it does not have the holiness of Shemitah, you have to take off trumos and masros, because it is only Shemitah produce that is exempt from trumos and masros, and non-Shemitah produce is obligated in trumos and masros. That is Rav Yosef Karo's opinion. The Mabit's opinion was that ownership of non-Jewish land in Eretz Yisrael does not take away the holiness of Shemitah, and therefore all of the laws of Shemitah will still apply, but the peiros are going to be exempt from Trumas and Masros because they're peiros Shavias. Now, let's fast forward, which we began talking about, the idea of the Heter Mechira, in which there is a mass sale of the land to an Arab or whatever it is before the Shemitah year. And there are a number of questions. What is it supposed to accomplish? Number one. Is it a valid sale? Number two. Is it a permissible sale? Number three. And number four, what relevance does it have to me as a consumer, since I'm not a farmer and I'm not involved in any of that anyway? So you'll recall, just to go over a little bit of the history again, that a wide-scale development of agricultural settlements that were Jewishly cultivated and owned essentially began in the latter third of the 19th century. You're talking about the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Jewish olim, primarily from Russia, began to purchase fields and orchards and just vacant real estate, and they began to establish agricultural settlements. Some of them were religious, some of them were not religious. Some of them cared about Shemitah, some of them just didn't care about Shemitah at all. The major financiers of all of these acquisitions, there were a number of them. One was Moses Montefiore, who was a little earlier, the great British aristocrat. By the way, when you see the name Moshe in many neighborhoods in Yerushalayim, Kiryat Moshe, Yamin Moshe, Maskeret Moshe, he is the Moshe after whom all of these neighborhoods are named, because he's the one who gave the money. It's interesting that there was a whole little, we talked a few weeks ago about walking on the Harabayit. So it was interesting. Moses Montefiore was an observant Jew. He was a religious Jew. He was not necessarily a learned Jew, but he was a Shomer Mitzvos. And when he came here, a maskil, a kind of an enlightened person, wanted to give him a tour of the Temple Mount, which was in violation of the psak of the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim, that Bisman Hazeh we're not allowed to go on the Temple Mount. I know that the controversy has been reopened in recent years, but there is no question historically that over the past 200 years, the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim have always prohibited going on the Temple Mount because of Tumah and the like. But a certain maskil told Moses Montefiore that it's going to be okay because, after all, the Ravid permits it. And indeed, the Ravid does permit it because it's the Shita of the Ravid that the Temple Mount does not have holiness after the Churban, and therefore all of the laws of purity and impurity don't apply. It is correct. According to the Ravid, it's mutter. The problem is we don't paskin like the Ravid, but they didn't get into that subtlety. So Moses Montefiore went on the Temple Mount, and this created a major, major uproar in the religious community of Yerushalayim that he was their main benefactor. And he's violating halakha. So they were thinking about cutting off all receiving of support from him. They were not going to take a cent from him, which would have had devastating impact on the economic survival of the old Haredi Yishuv in Yerushalayim. So suffice it to say, they did work it out. It would have been so catastrophic to them that they had a meeting with him, and he explained that he just didn't know the halacha and he was deceived, and they accepted that as a good faith apology, and that got it over. But be it as it may, Montefiore was a major support, and the other was a person who was not as religious, and this was Baron Rothschild, Edmund Rothschild of Paris, who was a major, major, major philanthropist of the agricultural settlements in the land of Israel. Even today, you will see, as you go through Yerushalayim, a number of buildings, a number of schools that are called the Rothschild School. They tend to be more secular institutions, but he was a very, very prominent philanthropist. But the issue was, as I say, some of the farmers, whether it's Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, these agricultural settlements, many were not religious and they were not raising a Shemitah concern. Others were religious and they were worried about what are we going to do during Shemitah. In those days, they weren't really importing that much food from other countries. And if we're not able to grow food, how are we going to live? So it's important to know that already in the 1880s, the Shemitahs of the 1880s, there were Sephardic rabbis in Eretz Yisrael who did basically say, by selling the land to the non-Jew, we will be allowed to do Shemitah work, because just as when we sell our chametz and we don't own our chametz, we don't transgress the sin of owning chametz on Pesach, because it's not our chametz, so too, if we sell the land to the non-Jew, this is following Rav Yosef Karo, but you'll see, it does not have the holiness of Shemitah, and the Shemitah laws would be suspended, right? This became known as the Heter, Mechira, the dispensation of selling the land to the non-Jew. Again, everybody associates this with Rav Kook. Rav Kook was not the inventor of this procedure. This procedure was already in effect in the 1880s for a number of the agricultural settlements that were cultivated by the Charedim. However, the Rabbanut in Yerushalayim, which was there was no Jewish state at that point, but the Eda Charedis, basically, the Beis Din in Yerushalayim for Ashkenazim, was very much against it, and they actually proclaimed that it is forbidden to have such an arrangement. So the opposition of the Eda Charedis to the Heter Mechira goes all the way back to the 1880s. They were against it to the very, very beginning. Actually, I don't want to be... it probably was not called the Eda Charedis at that point, but it was Rav Shmuel Salant, the original Beis Din of Ashkenazim in Yerushalayim. Yeah.
1880s, I guess, under the Ottoman Empire, I think most land was technically owned by the Sultan, I guess similar to how it is in Israel, where most land's owned by the state,
yeah,
like a long lease.
Yeah.
And it was based on production. If you didn't produce enough, they changed it. So my question is, like, in a sense, back then, they weren't really they weren't technically selling it to a goy, because they were just selling their their lease to the goy.
Well,
and then my question is today, is it actually possible to sell anything to a goy since it's really all owned by the state of Israel?
Yes, so the question becomes this. The question becomes, and we'll talk about it as we go on, the question becomes whether halacha regards at some point a long-term lease that essentially allows for the usage of land in perpetuity. Do we somehow deem that to be ownership at some point? Because at some point, your control and your domination of the land is so complete that the fact that it's technically a lease may not matter, because we may call it an ownership interest and the like. So again, it is important that you know that Rav Kook did not invent the Heter Mechira. Now Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Kook, person that you don't hear about too much in the Haredi yeshiva world, but it's someone that you should at least be familiar with, was a Litvisha person. He was a Rav in Lithuania, actually. He was a Talmud of the Volozhiner yeshiva at a time when the Nitziv was the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. He was very, very close to the Nitziv. In fact, the Nitziv was said to have said that if the whole yeshiva of Volozhin was worthwhile to be established just to produce a person like Rav Kook. It's interesting that the Nitziv himself was an early kind of supporter of Zionism, and Rav Kook may have absorbed a lot of the attitudes from the Nitziv. The Nitziv was also a very conciliatory person. Again, one could imagine the chicken and egg, whether either Rav Kook was influenced by the Nitziv, or more likely, he drew himself to the Nitziv because their personalities were so similar in that way. But Rav Kook had a great love for Eretz Yisrael, and he came to Eretz Yisrael in the very, very early years of the 20th century, and he became the Rav of Yafo. Now, all of you have heard of Tel Aviv, Yafo, but in those days there was no Tel Aviv, there was only Yafo. Yafo is a port on the Mediterranean, and it's a very ancient port. In point of fact, it's mentioned in Tanakh a number of times, or Nach a number of times. In fact, Yonah, right? When Yonah went on the boat to escape God, he took a boat from Yafo. That's the same Yafo that we have today. So Yafo was never a big city, but of course nothing was a big city in Palestine at the time. But Yafo was a major, for Palestine, a major port under the Ottoman Empire. Tel Aviv started getting developed only in the 1920s. Rav Kook was alive for the beginning of Tel Aviv as well, but there literally was no Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv came out of nowhere as a suburb of Yafo, although it obviously became much bigger than Yafo itself. So Rav Kook was not, he didn't have a big territory. He was not the Rav over a lot of people. He was the Rav of Yafo, plus the settlements around Yafo. But Rav Kook was very attuned to the fact that there were farmers that if they wouldn't be able to produce the land, there would be starvation. Many of them would die. As I mentioned the other day, there was mass starvation in Israel anyway. People were dropping dead in the street, non-Shemitah years. One does not have a sense of how horrendous and difficult the economic conditions were. Today, we might complain about Ben and Jerry boycotts or whatever it is, or they don't have crunchy Skippy, they only have smooth Skippy. Those are kind of our complaints. But then you were really dealing with starvation. So as a result, Rav Kook validated the Heter Mechira. He didn't invent it. He validated it. He streamlined it. He developed a kind of a structure for the Heter Mechira. And as I mentioned, he wrote a wonderful, wonderful sefer explaining the justification for the Heter Mechira. And this is the sefer Shabbat Ha'aretz, which I believe only very recently, maybe the past few years, has been translated into English. One has to know that Rav Kook was not ignorant of the objections to Heter Mechira. Every single objection he was aware of, and he addressed. Now, I'm not saying he's the final word necessarily. Many, many Gedolim disagreed with his point, but under no circumstances can you ever say he was not aware of the problems. There was not a single problem he was not aware of and did not address. But as I say, there are machloksim whether his solutions are accepted or not. So as a result, ever since then, the Heter Mechira has been associated with Rav Kook. Now Rav Kook had a very interesting life in that way. He was the Rav of Yafo, but shortly before World War I, he took a trip with his wife, Baruch Hashem, it's with his wife, you'll see, to go to the founding of Agudas Yisrael, kind of a religious convention to found a movement, which was in Breitowitz in Germany. And he went with the intention of coming back. World War I broke out. And for more than 5 years, Rav Kook was unable to return to Eretz Yisrael. He was stranded in the Golah for 5 years, first in Switzerland, and then he actually took a position as a rabbi in London to an Eastern European Yiddish-speaking congregation. And he had a condition in his contract that if at any point travel back to Palestine would become possible, he would have the right to leave his contract immediately. That was stipulated in the contract itself. One can only imagine, given Rav Kook's phenomenal love for Eretz Yisrael, something that we can't even imagine, how painful this was. And indeed, it's recorded that when he was offered opportunities to tour the very, very pretty British countryside, he refused to do that, to see the countryside. He says, there is no countryside I want to see other than the hills and the valleys of Eretz Yisrael. I have no interest in seeing pastures or hills of England. If it's not Eretz Yisrael, I'm not interested. It is recorded, however, that he would occasionally go to the British Museum, and he especially enjoyed Rembrandt's. Now, Rembrandt painted a number of rabbis, and the rabbis said, well, Rembrandt's paintings generally, there's a certain glow, there's a certain aura of light, and Rav Kook said that Rembrandt had a sensitivity to the light of Kedusha and the Hadras Panim of rabbis, so he did enjoy Rembrandt. Be it as it may, Baruch Hashem, he was with his wife. He could have gone by himself, and that would have been much more of a personal tragedy. He was with his wife. I believe he was with his son as well. Later we get Rav Yehuda Kook. But be it as it may, he came back to Eretz Yisrael, and at some point he became the Rav of Yerushalayim, and eventually under the British mandate, this is before the state, he became the Rav of Eretz Yisrael, of Palestine, the first chief rabbi of Palestine, not the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel. He died in the 30s. The state of Israel is 1948. And many, many people accepted him as their leader. Many people did not accept him. Rav Kook was very controversial. He certainly was an absolute gadol in Shas and Poskim, absolutely. He was Rebbe Yoshev's not only Shadchan, but he was also Mesader Kedushin, Rebbe Yoshev. So Rebbe Yoshev married Rav Aryeh Levin's daughter, and Rav Aryeh Levin was very close to Rav Kook, and he thought Rebbe Yoshev would be a good match for his daughter. Rebbe Yoshev at that point felt he was so dirt poor that he wouldn't even be able to support a wife, and Rav Kook convinced him to get married, and Rav Kook was Mesader Kedushin. So what happened is very interesting. Again, I mean, this is a bit of a digression. We'll come back to the main point in a minute. What happened was, as Rebbe Yoshev became acknowledged as the Gadol in the Haredi world, which he was, Rebbe Yoshev was the Gadol Hador. But as the Haredi world itself got more and more negative against Rav Kook, so people figured they could just say bad things about Rav Kook in front of Rebbe Yoshev. Like, Rav Kook is bad-mouthed in a lot of places. He was, too friendly with non-religious Jews, and, his hashkaf is krum and the like. So people felt they could talk in front of Rebbe Yoshev about this because, after all, every yeshiva, that's how people talk. But they didn't realize that if you would say anything negative about Rav Kook in Rebbe Yoshev's presence, he would kick you out of the house. He would say, you don't know who you're talking about. He's a Gaon and a Kadosh and a holy person. And his understandings of things are beyond our understandings of things. And it's a tremendous chutzpah, right? So people figured, Rebbe Yoshev is like guilt by association. Rebbe Yoshev equals Haredi, Haredi equals anti-Rav Kook, therefore Rebbe Yoshev equals anti-Rav Kook. Big mistake, and in fact you might find yourself blacklisted and never be able to come back into Rebbe Yoshev's house again. In fact, there was a sefer that on the Rambam that anthologized many chidushim from different achronim, and that they included Rav Kook's chidushim. So one of the editors, who was very zealous, decided on his own to remove Rav Kook's chidushim from the Rambam because Rav Kook is not of our Gedolim. And when his superior got wind of that, he fired him. So the fired editor went to Rabbi Yashiv complaining about an injustice, that he was fired because he did a righteous act. And Rabbi Yashiv said to him, you deserve to be fired, and if I would be involved in this project, I certainly would have fired you as well. Right? So one has to be aware of this. There are many aspects of Rav Kook that are controversial, many issues in which other Gedolim argued with him. This is Darka Shel Torah. There are different approaches to things. There are machloksim. But to denigrate and not recognize the greatness of someone who is an undisputed Gadol B'Torah is really mavazeh Talmid Chacham. Right? The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that if one behaves disrespectfully towards a Talmid Chacham, that is one of the things that cause you to lose your share in Olam Haba. Mavazeh Talmid Chacham is one definition of an apikoros. He doesn't have a share in Olam Haba. Okay, so Rav Kook validated the Heter Mechira, and he created the structure for it. And ever since then, this has been the policy of the Rabbanut HaRashit, which was the Israeli rabbinate since 1948, to have a mass sale of land for anyone who wants to participate. You as a farmer have to agree. You authorize the Rabbanut to act as your shaliach to sell the land to non-Jews. Now, everybody who spent any time in any yeshiva knows that, the yeshiva world, we don't trust Heter Mechira. In fact, I sometimes think that if a guy went over to you and put a gun to your head and gave you two choices, either eat Heter Mechira or I'll kill you, or you can eat Chazer or I'll kill you, I think some people would say, all right, I'll go with the Chazer. Because Heter Mechira is considered to be like the worst possible Aveira you could commit. I mean, maybe short of converting to Christianity or something. So the question is, I just want to discuss what the issue here is. First of all, what does the Heter Mechira seek to accomplish? What are you trying to do with it? So you understand that the Heter Mechira is based on Rav Yosef Kairo's idea. Rav Yosef Kairo's idea is that land that belongs to a non-Jew is not subject to the holiness of Shemitah. That goes back to, Rav Kook didn't invent that idea, and the Sephardic rabbis of the 1880s didn't invent that idea. That is Rav Yosef Kairo's shita, that the fruit that grows on non-Jewish land does not have the status of Shemitah Kedusha. Okay? Now, remember that was called Yevul Nachri. So, Rav Kook said, if it doesn't have the status of the holiness of Shemitah, then a Jew would be permitted to work on that land. Because a Jew cannot work on sanctified land that is subject to the Shemitah laws. If non-Jewish land is not subject to the Shemitah laws, the Jewish farmer can work, can cultivate, can generate peiros. Those peiros don't have the halachos of Shemitah, and therefore that's going to be mutter. Right? That's the purpose of it. In other words, the purpose basically was to enable Jewish farmers, right, to cultivate their land and therefore avoid starvation or poverty or the like. Which means the Heter Mechira even makes sense only if you make an assumption that once the land belongs to a goy, a Jew is allowed to work the land. Because if you're going to tell me that even after I sell the land to the goy, a Jew cannot work the land, then there's absolutely nothing you've accomplished by selling the land to the goy. So implicit in Heter Mechira is the following proposition: land in Eretz Yisrael that belongs to a goy can be cultivated by a Jewish farmer, because land that is owned by a goy in Eretz Yisrael does not have holiness with respect to the Shemitah laws. That is what the Heter Mechira is premised on. What would the precedent of the Heter Mechira be? Rav Yosef Kairo, who says that peiros on a goy's field do not have the holiness of Shemitah. Right? So this is an extension of that. Okay. So here, now, I want to point out that I said before, Rav Yosef Kairo's Shita was indeed the psak of many, 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 many Gedolim, including the Eidach HaRedis today. The Eidach HaRedis today, which is against the Heter Mechira, is 100% supportive of the idea that produce that grows on non-Jewish fields is not subject to Shemitah. So the truth of the matter is, the foundation of the Heter Mechira is agreed upon by the Eidach HaRedis. So what's the issue? The issue is this. The issue basically is, and we won't be able to go into all of the lumbus, and that is, many, many people, including Rav Yosef Karo himself, said that there's a difference between the holiness of the land and the holiness of the produce of the land. Meaning to say, Rav Yosef Karo never ruled that a Jewish farmer can cultivate the land that belongs to a non-Jew. He simply said the produce of a non-Jewish farmer on non-Jewish land does not have the holiness of Shemitah in terms of not wasting and the like. But the etzem land is Kadesh, and therefore I, as a Jew, am not allowed to cultivate. So this is the key point here. The key point, there'll be other points, but the key point about the Heter Mechira is Rav Yosef Karo's rule that the produce of non-Jews in Eretz Yisrael does not have the holiness of Shemitah, is that a psak only with respect to the produce, or even with respect to the land? Rav Kook, or the supporters of the Heter Mechira, say that Rav Yosef Kairo's reasoning should apply equally to permit avodah on the land. Ergo, the Heter Mechira is a vehicle that allows Jewish farmers to make a living by cultivating this land. Those who oppose the Heter Mechira, there'll be other arguments, but their central argument is, hey, Rav Yosef Karo only says the produce does not have the holiness of Shemitah, but the land does, and therefore it is prohibited for a Jew to work the land. Meaning, one position here is that even if the land is sold to a guy, that is not going to allow working of the land. Okay, so that is issue number one. In other words, what does the sale accomplish? Rav Kook would say, the sale enables a Jewish farmer to work the land based on Rav Yosef Kairo's Shita that which is owned by a non-Jew does not have Kedusha. The counter-argument is, even accepting Rav Yosef Kairo, that only works for the peiros not having the holiness of Shemitah, and that's even the Badatz agrees with. Yavul Nachri, I buy Arab produce, I don't have to eat it with the laws of Shemitah, but it does not have a hafka'ah, it does not have a nullification of the holiness of the land. Okay? So that's issue number one. What does the sale attempt to accomplish? And why would it work or not work? Answer, it seeks to permit a Jewish farmer to cultivate his land during Shemitah, and that itself will be a machlokas if that's going to work. Now, let me point out the obvious. If you went with the Mabit's opinion, then you have no point to start whatsoever, meaning the Mabit says even the peiros have the holiness of Shemitah. So you understand that the Heter Mechira cannot exist at all according to the Mabit. Okay, that's fine. But within the Beis Yosef, we will have a machlokas, how far Rav Yosef Kairo's Heter is. So the Heter Mechira is based on Rav Yosef Kairo, but again, that itself is not a problem, because even the Eidach HaRedis follows Rav Yosef Kairo, because it says Yivul Nachri does not have the holiness of Shemitah. Okay? Alrighty. All right. Now, issue number two is the sale a permitted sale? Meaning, even if you accept that once it belongs to a guy, a Jew could work on it. Are you allowed to sell land to a guy? Now here is something that you need to know. There is a pasuk in Parshas V'yaschanan that says, it's talking about the 7 nations of Canaan, and it says, Lo sechanem, do not give them grace, do not show them compassion. The simple meaning is, get rid of them. But Chazal have a drasha. There's a number of drashas in Maseches Avodah Zarah. And one of the drashos is that instead of looking at it as chen, grace, we look at it like chaniyah, encampment. Do not give them encampment, chaniyah, in the land. And this translates into a very interesting halacha that maybe some people aren't aware of. It is an iser da'oraisa to sell land in Eretz Yisrael to a non-Jew. You are not allowed to sell land to a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael. I can sell land to a non-Jew in Chutz La'aretz, and I can sell movable things. I can sell my car to a guy in Eretz Yisrael, but I cannot sell real estate. So the question becomes, Heter, Mechira, what on earth are you talking about? You're selling the land of Eretz Yisrael to a non-Jew? Even if you assume that it will work as a mechanism that will allow the Shemitah. Let's assume it works. Just because it works doesn't mean it's permitted. What about Lo Sechanem? Now, I want to add that the Chazon Ish had a little twist of the knife here. Because the Chazon Ish's argument was this. Typically, the land is not sold directly by the farmer who owns it. He makes the Rabbanut a shaliach, right? Just like chametz. I make the Rabbanut my shaliach to sell land. The sale is through agency. So this is the Chazon Ish's twist of the knife. We have a klal in shlichus, ein shaliach lidvar aveira. That means, if I make you a shaliach to commit a sin, the shalichus is invalid. So the Chazon Ish said, since the sale of the land is in violation of lo sechanem, not only is it a sinful action, it'll now become an invalid action. It still belongs to the farmer. The sale through a shaliach will not be a valid sale because of ein shaliach v'ra'avera, so you've done nothing. Okay, we'll talk about how the Rabbanut addresses that. They actually found a way around the Chazon Ish's taina. Lo sechanem is a major, major issue. It is a major issue. In fact, some people say it is the major issue. Once again, Rav Kook offers a number of solutions. Again, not everybody agrees. Poskim will disagree with him. But he says a number of things. First of all, he points out that there are some opinions that say that the iser of selling land to a guy is only to an idol worshiper, an oved avodah zarah, a pagan. And Islam, with all of the problems we have with Islam, Islam is a monotheistic religion. Even the Rambam, who suffered greatly from Islamic persecution, and he called Muhammad a Meshuggah, and he said, they have done worse to us than all of the nations of the world have ever done. But the Rambam did rule very clearly that Islam is not idolatrous. Now Christianity, which has many, many different forms, as you know, is a well-known machlokas. How does halacha classify Christianity or different types of Christianity? The Rambam does say that Christianity, which to his mind was either Catholicism or Coptic religion, the Rambam does treat that as idolatrous and pagan. Rabbeinu Tam, who lived in France, a Catholic country, actually said that for a Noachide it is not idolatry, meaning to say it's a mistaken belief system, but technically, since there is a belief in a supreme God, it is a monotheistic religion. Okay, so that's a machlokas about Christianity, very important machlokas, but an Arab that's a Muslim, or any Muslim, is not an Oved Avodah Zarah. So Rav Kook goes through various sources that perhaps you are permitted to sell land to a non-idolatrous goy. So again, a machlokas, but this would be one basis of the Heter. Another basis of the heter is that lo sechanem is only if it is a permanent sale. You are giving the non-Jew a permanent ownership in the land. This is designed to be temporary because you're only doing it for a zaman and then you'll get it back, like the chametz. So Rav Kook argues that there are views that say that since the Torah doesn't use the phrase, thou shalt not sell, the Torah uses the phrase, thou shalt not give them a permanence, chaniyah, a permanence in the land. Any sale which is not a permanent sale would be permitted. And there are other svaras too, that maybe it's only prohibited if it's a sale that gives them residence. I mean, here the Jewish farmer is going to continue to cultivate his farm. You're not giving the non-Jew any type of residence, so you could sell to foreign investors. Again, these are different possibilities. And finally, Rav Kook comes up with an idea, and he brings a raya to this. I'll show you what the raya is, that when the purpose of the sale is to strengthen Jewish settlement rather than dilute it, right? The Torah says don't sell to a guy because you don't want to dilute the Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael. That's the idea here. But this is the other way around. By creating a mechanism that will allow the cultivation by Jewish farmers, the sale to the goy is strengthening Jewish settlement rather than weakening Jewish settlement. And under such a circumstance, it would be permitted because you're doing exactly the opposite of what the Aveira was supposed to prevent, the dilution of a Jewish settlement. Now, again, I am not presenting this as holy writ, so to speak. These are Rav Kook's arguments. Those who are opposed, including the Chazon Ish, who came a little later, the Chazon Ish felt that these are like post hoc justifications, and the Chazon Ish was very strong on this, that there's an Isser D'Oraisa of selling real estate to a non-Jew, whether it's monotheistic or non-monotheistic, whether it's temporary or permanent, whether it's resident or non-resident, whether it is for the purpose of facilitating Jewish settlement or not. So again, I'm giving you Rav Kook's arguments because you need to know Rav Kook's arguments, but you also need to know that there are many, many great Gedolim, indeed most of the Haredi Gedolim, who have rejected these arguments. Now, so again, do you understand that we're dealing with two different questions here? And be sure you understand the difference. The first question is, does the Mechira accomplish the purpose for which you're allowing it? The second question is, even if it does accomplish the purpose, are you allowed to do it? Those are two different questions. Those who are machmir are usually machmir on both, but theoretically there are machmirim on one point. In other words, there are people who might agree that the Mechira would help, but you're not allowed to do it, right? So there are two different issues. There's the Isser Shebedavar, and then there's the effectiveness of the Mechira, right? The permissibility of the Mechira and the effectiveness of the Mechira. These are two different questions. Yeah?
You mentioned earlier that if you are a guest at someone's house, that some of these things don't apply with Shemitah because you're not actually paying for it.
Yeah, I'll get to it. That's the next. Yeah.
My question is, if you go to a place, the bread that they're using has a good hechsher, but it says Heter Mechira there. In most places, if you buy a sandwich, like all the vegetables are complimentary anyway. Like they're not going to charge you extra for them. So, is it okay? Or?
We'll come to it. Remember, I had mentioned that the fourth question I want to address is how does this apply to a consumer? So we will get to that. Right now, we're talking about it on the farmer level, on the Rabbanut level. Yeah.
Why would this be any different from, let's say, the argument of giving away land to various Israel for security purposes? If this is also...
Yeah. Okay. So again, the question becomes, this issue of giving land to non-Jews obviously comes up in land for peace, in territorial negotiations. How are we allowed to give up land to non-Jews? So the common justification that's given there is that if there is a security determination that by giving up land, territorial concessions, you will be saving Jewish lives, which is, by the way, usually an erroneous consideration, but at least the official consideration is we are saving Jewish lives by territorial concessions, so you're allowed to transgress the law of Lo Seichanem for Pikuach Nefesh. The question becomes whether Shemitah would exist at that level. Today, for sure, it would not. I mean, in Rav Kook's time, maybe so. But to talk about Pikuach Nefesh, to talk about people who are going to drop dead without the Heter Mechira, that is a wild exaggeration. That is not going to happen. But in Rav Kook's time, it might have happened. In fact, I pointed out that Rav Kook was not enthusiastic about the Heter Mechira. He saw it as a necessity based on the mass starvation that existed in what was called Palestine at the time. And many have said, I mean, we're speculating, that had Rav Kook been alive today, he would not have permitted the arrangement of Heter Mechira. That probably is a strong argument. Nevertheless, the Rabbanut does continue it. And part of what they continue is this. They say, listen, I mean, again, this is an interesting question. A lot of the farmers that we are signing up on the Heter Mechira, they're not religious. So here's the thing. If we would abolish the Heter Mechira, they're not going to keep Shemitah. They're going to just violate Shemitah 100%. So at least we're giving them away where, according to some opinions, they're not in violation of Shemitah. Okay, so the Rabbanut's argument is that even if the Heter Mechira is controversial, it is much better to have it than not to have it. Not from a consumer standpoint, but from a farmer standpoint, because this is a way that we could be matzil many non-religious people from violating the laws of Shemitah. Sure. Now, by the way, that's the general raison d'etre of Rabbanut Hashgachos, which are sometimes a little bit lenient, but they basically, listen, for some of our clientele, if we were to require a higher level of supervision that costs more money, they wouldn't go with it and they would serve treif. So this way we have a certain minimal standard of kashrus, which on balance is better than not being kosher at all. So one way of viewing the Heter Mechira with all of the controversies is better to have it than not to have it, because many farmers are not religious, but they'll sign a paper authorizing the rabbis to sell the land if it's not going to infringe on their lifestyle that much. Same thing with chametz, right? A lot of people stores that sell chametz are not religious, but they'll go with the chametz sale if that will. I'm sorry, did you want to say something? Yeah.
I was going to ask, was Rav Kook's rationale for Pikuach Nefesh as well for Heter Mechira? Would it have been... would Rav Kook's rationale for Heter Mechira have been Pikuach Nefesh effectively? Was it because there was a starvation? Was it Pikuach?
Yeah. So again, Rav Kook, see, here's the thing. I mean, if you really called it Pikuach Nefesh, forget about Heter Mechira. Just work during Shemitah. In other words, you don't have to do anything if it's Pikuach Nefesh. But this was a situation in which it's called Karov L'Pikuach Nefesh. In other words, it was very close to risking people's lives and health, and therefore, in such a situation, we use lenient halachic views that we might otherwise not use. Okay, so again, these are two important issues. The effectiveness of the sale, based on Rav Yosef Karo, the permissibility of the sale. Now, let me just mention a third issue, which, interestingly enough, people still bring up, but the Knesset took this issue away. One of the old attacks on Heter Mechira, going back to the 1920s, was the sale was not a legal sale under Ottoman law and later Israeli law, because it was not registered in the tabo. Tabo is the Turkish term for the land records. That sales of real estate were not considered legal. This is true in the United States as well, unless they're recorded in land offices. And this was just like a quickie little sale, and nobody bothered to go to the time and expense of recording it in the land office. Therefore, they said it is not a legal sale, and if it's not a legal sale, it's halachically an invalid sale as well. And that's the old argument you'll see over and over again. It is not rashum b'tabo. It is not registered in the tabo. Tabo is the land office. The term is still used today, although it's really a Turkish or an Arabic term. So I just want to point out, interestingly enough, that a number of years ago, the Knesset passed a law exempting from land registration sales pursuant to the Heter Mechira of the Rabbanut. So if anybody brings up the Tabo argument, you can tell them that's totally false. Because in point of fact, Heter Mechira sales are exempted from land registration. So that particular thing is now a red herring that shouldn't be relevant. Okay, now, the final issue, which I'll leave for tomorrow, is a very important issue. Okay, so we're debating, are you allowed to sell the land? Are you not allowed to sell the land? Is it effective to let the farmer work or not effective to let the farmer work? Is it a legal sale or not a legal sale? Okay, that's fine. If I'm a farmer and I'm debating, should I join up with the Heter Mechira? I got all of these halakhic questions to think about. But why does that apply to me? I want to buy a bag of potato chips in Ben Gurion Airport that says Heter Mechira on it. Or I want to go to a certain restaurant that has a Tudat Kashrut and it says Heter Mechira. What is the problem that I face? I mean, I'm not the guy that sold my land to the guy. I'm not the farmer that's farming that land. So this is an interesting question that is often not explored. How do the problems of Heter Mechira impact on me as a consumer, or as a guest, or as an invitee to a chasna, etc.? Why do I have to care about that? Why is it important for me to be aware of this? Why do they have to label things as Heter Mechira? Say it's kosher, what difference does it make? Okay, so tomorrow we'll discuss this very important issue. What is the relevance of Heter Mechira on a consumer level who is not selling land and not doing any farming? Okay, see you tomorrow.